Hello, and welcome back to They Might Be Morally Correct, a podcast with an auto-generated name. Today we will be going over the case of Joshua Maddux, the boy in the chimney, and on Joshua and his disappearance. Then I'll describe the state in which his remains were found, and then give you an update on where the case is at currently. Joshua Verdon Maddux disappeared on May 8, 2008 in Woodland Park, Colorado. His body was found August 7, 2015, also in Woodland Park. On May 8th, Josh, who was 18 at the time, left his house to take a walk. He liked to be outside, so this was nothing out of the ordinary. But he never returned, and he was never seen alive again. 7 years later, in August of 2015, less than a mile away from Josh's home, property developer Chuck Murphy was demolishing an old wooden cabin to make way for 32 new family homes. The cabin had not been used in years, and inside it was falling apart. It was rotten, it was damp, and really just everything was everywhere. So there was work to demolish it. And when they got to the chimney, they ended up happening upon the mummified remains of Josh. He was unrecognizable at first, but they'd used his dental records to identify him, which by the way is an incredibly reliable way of identifying someone. One detail about the state in which his remains were found was that he was naked apart from a thin shirt, and his clothes were neatly stacked inside the cabin. So, what happened? Was this a homicide? Did he do this to himself? And if so, what caused him to do this? And how? How did he even get in there? But before this, who was Josh as a person? Josh was born on March 9th, 1990, and lived in Woodland Park, Colorado, a town of about 8,000 people. His parents were divorced, and Josh lived with his father, Mike, and two sisters, Kate and Ruth. He had long, blonde hair, and he was 6 feet tall, and weighed around 150 pounds. He was down to earth, loved music, and spending his free time writing music or playing guitar. And at school, he was known for being incredibly bright and well-liked. But 2 years before his disappearance, on June 1st, 2006, a week before his high school graduation, his brother Zach, who was 18, committed suicide after suffering from severe depression. This was obviously a huge surprise to the family, and especially Josh, because he was incredibly close with his brother. It really pushed him over the edge. But two years later, fast forward back to 2008, it seemed that Josh was doing a lot better, despite his disappearance. Mike said, and I quote, "I got up one morning and Josh was there. Then he just never came home. The next day he still didn't come home. I called his friends. Nobody had seen him. Nobody knows where he is." Everyone, including authorities, friends, and family, started looking for him. They looked around the neighborhood. They looked nearby Parkland area. Maybe he walked in that direction. Maybe he went in that direction to start a new life. That's what his sister Kate had hoped, that he had left town to go and play music or start a different life, since those were things that he was passionate about and talked about prior to his disappearance. But after months of searching, they hadn't uncovered anything. A further quote from his sister Kate. She said, Since Josh was 18, it has been reasonable to assume he may have decided to leave town to start a new life. As one of his two sisters, I have always chosen to believe that was the case. I have expected Josh to return home to my father's house at any time with a wife and small children so that they can meet their grandparents and two aunts. Josh has always been known for his musical and literary talent, so maybe we would find him playing music with a band on tour, or catch him writing successful novels under a pen name so that he could keep his preferred lifestyle of solitude in the woods. So now more information on the cabin. It had not been used for 10 years, and it, as I said prior, it was gross. It was falling apart, everything was everywhere, there was rotting wood, and it had not been occupied since 2005, which was 3 years before Josh disappeared. At the time of his disappearance, it had been used as a storage facility, and no one really visited it all. So Josh's body being found there was a surprise, but at the same time, since nobody had really been there, it made sense for... If it was foul play, it made sense that a body was placed there. It was seen as a waste of space, the cabin. So, the man who owns it, the property, decided to demolish the cabin and use the space to create housing. And so demolition started in August of 2015, and they had gotten to I think they started with the chimney, and as they were tearing that down, they discovered Josh's body. So now a description of the state in which his remains were found. Obviously in the chimney, he was stuck in a fetal position with his legs above his head. As I believe I said earlier, he was mummified, so I believe because Colorado can be incredibly cold, but then it can be incredibly hot, and because he was in such a cramped space, it caused his body to mummify over time. None of the articles that I read mentioned any interference of his remains by animals, no consumption or influence on the decomposition process. Alborn said, "The hard tissue showed no signs of trauma. There were no broken bones, no knife marks. There were no bullet holes. There is so far no answers to a number of things. It is very confusing. It was not instant death. How he died is only a matter of speculation, but we know he did not starve to death." In the quote it says starved. And is it starved or starve? Anyway, he did not starve to death because that takes many weeks. So then you go down the chain and you have dehydration, which can take just a few days, and the other thing would be hypothermia, which could take a day or two. We have no evidence to say which one came first, which will kind of play into the discrepancies once I explain. His body had been found in a fetal position, which I mentioned earlier, with his legs above his head, but they were disjointed from his torso. And so in order for him to have gotten into this position, he would have had to enter the chimney head first. But the thing is, there was a metal mesh wire covering the top of the chimney, and there were no signs of it being removed prior to demolition. And the thing is, Josh's body had been there for such a long time, it wouldn't have made sense. It doesn't really make sense how his body got up there. Even if he got up there from the bottom of the chimney or the chimney that was inside of the house where the wood would go, it doesn't really make sense how his legs got above his head. So because of this, the case was reopened by the coroner Alborn, but not much has changed, to be completely honest. It's very confusing. So this is where I've expressed how confused I am about this, but most of my confusion comes around how first of all, how he got in the chimney. Because maybe he fell down there, and then thinking about it from the perspective of it not being foul play, he removed the mesh from the top of the chimney. He goes down head first, and so my question is, were his legs disjointed from his torso as he was falling down, or were they disjointed from his torso over time as his body decomposed? If that makes sense. Because perhaps if maybe he died at the top, like closer to the top of the chimney. Maybe they murdered him maybe he died of asphyxiation. I hope I said that right. Maybe they cut off his airway somehow that wouldn't show any trauma on his body, and then post-mortem they somehow placed him in the chimney, and his legs became dislocated over time as gravity pulled him down. But then I don't think there were any signs within the chimney walls of him sliding down, but then at the same time this did take place over 7 years, and at the point in which he was discovered, he was unrecognizable. I believe I mentioned this earlier, but he was also found only wearing a shirt and maybe socks, but that isn't really, the socks part I don't feel is very important, but he was only found wearing a shirt, and then the rest of him was completely nude. No underwear, no pants, nothing but a shirt. And inside the cabin, his clothes were found folded neatly next to the chimney. So there's something incredibly off about that just does not sit well with me at all. And then another part that I did not mention earlier, and I apologize for that, is that there was a giant, and you know how I mentioned that the cabin was falling apart? Well, there was a giant piece of wood that was dragged and placed at the base of the chimney within the cabin. It was positioned to cover, it seemed that it was positioned directly to directly cover the base of the chimney, as if someone had put it there to make sure that if gravity had prevailed and he had fallen all the way down to the bottom, that his body would have been covered or not easily be seen. I don't know how many times I will say this during the podcast, but it's so incredibly upsetting and confusing and just awful. Alborn does end up revising the autopsy report after an uproar from the town and Chuck Murphy, who owned the property in which Joshua's remains were found on. And he changes the cause of death to quote-unquote accidental death, murder, or underdetermined causes. He said, quote-unquote, "We've come up with the most plausible explanation, and it will remain an accident. He did come down the chimney. That's our conclusion," end quote. which doesn't really... It